I never knew how quickly life could change until the day two different vampire kings decided that I belonged to them. And sometimes when I look back on it, I still feel the same cold fear inside my chest, a heavy pressure that never really leaves, because even now I can remember how small and human I felt when the weight of two vampire realms suddenly turned toward me. And I realized that I was no longer living an ordinary life, but standing inside the center of a world shaped by ancient vampire laws, violent vampire history, and rival vampire rulers who never learned how to let go of what they wanted. I remember waking each morning feeling as if the world was widening around me, stretching in ways I didn't understand, because every time I looked at the sky or heard the wind, I felt as if something watched me, something old, something patient, something not human, and I did not yet know that both Stephen and Jake, the two vampire kings who ruled two different lands divided by dark mountains and cold forests, had been watching me for weeks before they ever stepped into my life, which means that my story did not begin on the day they appeared, but on the day they chose me from afar, marking me in their minds long before I ever knew the word vampire belonged anywhere near my name. My life had once been simple, almost painfully normal, because I worked a quiet job, walked home through quiet streets, and every evening I sat by the window watching the lights from distant towns, never realizing that beyond those lights lay entire vampire kingdoms, hidden from humans by ancient magic and old agreements that kept us from crossing into their lands, agreements that said humans should never know the vampire realms existed at all, because humans were fragile and vampires were ancient and their world was full of laws we would never understand. But something about me caught their attention, and sometimes I wonder if it was something simple like the way I walked, the way my mind worked, or the quiet strength I carried without ever noticing, because both Stephen and Jake later said in their own ways that humans like me were rare. Humans whose blood carried a soft glow, not magic, not power, just something pure and steady that vampires felt drawn to, something they thought they could protect or possess or claim. And when I learned that, I finally understood that nothing about this was personal, not at first, because to a vampire king, a human life is a small thing, like a candle in a hallway of flames. And yet somehow both kings decided that I was worth the risk, the attention, the trouble. The day Stephen marked me was the first moment I realized that the stories about vampires were not stories at all, because it happened so quietly and so simply that I didn't even understand what had occurred, only that I felt a strange warmth along the inside of my wrist, a heat that pulsed like a heartbeat that wasn't mine, a soft throb that made my skin tingle, and when I looked down there was a small mark there, a faint shape like a drop of blood pressed into my skin, glowing for a moment before it faded into something pale and silver. And I didn't know then that this was a vampire blood mark, one of the oldest and most powerful vampire bonds in the world. A bond that claimed me for the vampire king Stephen, whose cold, quiet kingdom sat deep in the north where the nights were long and the moon never rose without a red tint. For days afterward I felt watched, but not harmed, the way someone feels when a great storm is waiting on the horizon but hasn't reached the village yet. And while I tried to ignore the strange sensation that pulsed inside my wrist, I learned later that the blood mark allowed Stephen to feel my presence the way a hunter feels a distant ember in the dark. Not enough to control me, not enough to hurt me, but enough to find me. And he used that connection to watch over me from the shadows, convinced that I was destined for him because ancient vampire beliefs said a blood mark never formed unless vampire blood recognized something worthy in a human soul. But while Stephen watched me from the cold edges of the world, Jake watched me from the warm center of his kingdom, a place filled with bright fires, open courts, and restless vampire soldiers who followed him because he was bold and fierce and loud, nothing like Stephen's silent and restrained nature. And Jake believed in the old vampire law claim, a written law carved into stone long before any human city existed, a law that said a vampire king could choose a human by right of protection, claiming them under his crown as part of his realm's future. A law so powerful that once spoken, it could not be ignored by any vampire kingdom, not even enemies. Jake used that law on me before he ever touched me, before I ever saw him, because he had seen me once, far away, through an enchanted mirror that allowed him to view the human world, and he believed that he saw something inside me that matched the hunger in his kingdom because he ruled a place full of fire and passion, a world that wanted a queen who was not afraid to stand in the light. And when he used the law claim, the mark settled onto my shoulder like a faint ring of warmth, a soft pulse that wrapped around me like a necklace of light. And though I did not know what it was, Jake felt it across the world and believed that I now belonged to him. So when Stephen found out that Jake had used the law claim, he was furious in the cold, quiet way that only ancient vampires can be furious. And when Jake found out that Stephen had used the blood mark, he was furious in the loud, burning way that only fire-born vampires can be. And the vampire realms began to shake around me because two different vampire rites had been placed on the same human woman, and there was no rule, no guidance, no old story that said what should happen next. Because never once in vampire history had two vampire kings claimed the same human at the same time, and this meant that vampire laws were breaking, old rules were failing, and ancient alliances were trembling like thin branches in a storm. I was the human standing at the center of all of it, and I had no understanding of vampire kingdoms, vampire rules, vampire magic, or vampire duty. All I knew was that strange marks kept burning on my skin, strange feelings kept rushing through my body, and the nights began to feel heavier, as if the world around me was changing shape, pulling me towards something I could not escape. And sometimes I felt fear, but sometimes I felt something else too, something warm and strong, as if some invisible force was calling to me. When the two vampire kings finally came for me, the world around me seemed to stop moving, because Stephen arrived first, stepping out of a shadow behind my house, and even though I could not hear his footsteps, the air changed when he appeared, growing colder and sharper, like winter air that cuts the lungs, and I felt the blood mark on my wrist pulse in response to him, as if it recognized its creator, as if it wanted to pull me toward him. Then Jake came, not quietly at all, but arriving with a warm gust of air from the opposite side of the street, as if fire followed him wherever he walked, and I felt the law claim ring around my shoulder expand and glow faintly beneath my skin, reacting to him, calling to him. And for the first time in my life, I stood between two ancient vampire powers that wanted me. Two vampire kings whose rivalry was older than my entire family line, and I felt their eyes on me, one cold and deep, one warm and burning, and even though neither spoke a word, I understood that they had come to fight for me, not with swords or claws, but with the unbreakable laws of their worlds. And I knew that the vampire realms would soon be pulled into chaos because of the marks they placed on me, marks I never asked for, marks I now carried like heavy chains. In that moment, I realized something important and frightening. I was not a prize in their vampire war, not an object to decorate a kingdom, not a symbol for their rivalry. I was the spark. I was the reason their world was starting to fracture. I was the choice that would shape the future of two vampire realms. And if I did not choose wisely, if I did not find my own path through this darkness, then the whole world might burn on my behalf, simply because two vampire kings refused to let me go. When I walked away from the place where both vampire kings first stood before me, I felt the strange and frightening truth settle inside my chest like a heavy stone, because even though I told myself that I could run, hide, or pretend that none of this was real, I already understood that no human could ever escape two ancient vampire kings who had marked me with vampire magic and vampire rites, and as I moved through the streets, trying to calm my shaking hands, I knew deep down that both Stephen and Jake were following me from a distance, each one watching my steps with the silent patience and dangerous hunger that only immortal beings could possess. And the idea of being caught between two rival vampire kings made every breath inside me feel tight and fragile, as if the night itself was holding its breath with me. I kept walking through the quiet neighborhoods, trying to pretend that nothing in my life had changed, but the air behind me seemed to shift whenever I took a step, as if the shadows themselves were alive and watching, and I understood that Stephen, the cold and quiet vampire king who had placed the blood mark on my wrist, was somewhere behind me, moving with such silence that even the wind seemed unable to carry the sound of him. and every few moments I felt a faint pulse in the mark he gave me, a soft, steady throb that told me he was near, watching, waiting, guarding me with the kind of patience only a vampire hundreds of years old could have. But the warmth at my shoulder also glowed softly, reminding me that Jake, the bold and fierce vampire king who used the law claim on me, was following too. Not quietly like Stephen, but moving with a warm, steady presence, like a fire walking behind me, strong and confident and impossible to ignore. And whenever I felt the glow of the claim shift, I almost sensed his thoughts, not in words but in something simpler, something deeper, like the feeling of someone reaching out but stopping just short of touching my skin, holding himself back only because he knew that the vampire laws demanded caution during a double claim, especially when two vampire kings were involved. As I made my way home, I could feel their distant tension pressing against me, as if the two vampire kings were silently fighting behind me without speaking, each one stepping forward when the other stepped back, each one watching my movements with the same intense focus, but for completely different reasons. And I suddenly understood that the vampire realms were not built on peace or cooperation, but on old grudges, ancient power, and unbreakable bonds. And now those ancient forces were pushing me into the center of something far larger than anything I had ever imagined. When I reached my home, the world around me felt different, heavier, as if the night air itself was made of iron, and as I stepped inside, I realized that neither vampire king followed me past the doorway, because vampire kings could cross into human homes only through ancient permission, and both Stephen and Jake were too bound by old rules to break such a boundary, even though they were powerful enough to tear down the entire street if they wanted to claim me by force. But vampire kings lived in a world of laws. Old ones, strict ones, and even their rage had limits set by the ancient vampire traditions. Inside my house, I sat on the floor and tried to breathe, but the marks on my wrist and shoulder pulsed again, reminding me that I was not alone, not truly, because both vampire kings could feel me even now, could sense my heartbeat, my fear, my confusion, and maybe even the small spark of curiosity growing inside me because I wondered what made two powerful vampires choose me, a normal human woman with no magic, no power, and no connection to their world. And the more I tried to ignore that question, the louder it became inside my mind. It was in that moment, sitting in my small, quiet home, that I realized the danger I was in was not only from vampires claiming me, but from the entire vampire world watching those claims. Because vampire realms were ancient and proud, and no vampire kingdom wanted to appear weak, especially not when two rival kings were involved. And if word spread, and I knew it would, then vampire lords, vampire councils, vampire fighters, and vampire courts would begin to take sides, choosing whether the blood mark or the law claim held more power. And I knew that sooner or later, the whole vampire world would turn toward me, analyzing me, judging me, possibly even trying to remove me, not because of who I was, but because of what it meant for two vampire kings to want the same woman. As the night grew deeper, I walked to my window and looked out, expecting to see the empty street I always saw at night. But instead I felt the cold weight of Stephen's presence in the far shadows, like a still figure carved from moonlight and ice, watching me with that silent, steady patience that seemed to stretch across time. And on the opposite side I felt Jake, standing beneath a street lamp, glowing faintly with the warmth of his kingdom, his presence like fire wrapped in human shape, bold, bright, and unhidden. And the strangest part was that I could feel their emotions, not clearly like spoken words, but faintly through the marks they placed on me, and both marks pulsed with the same message, an awareness of danger rising around me. I began to understand then why the vampire kings had come for me in person, why they had allowed themselves to be seen, why they risked so much by appearing in the human world for the sake of one woman, and the reason was not romance or desire, not at first, but something deeper and far more dangerous. Because the moment two vampire kings claim the same human, the vampire laws demand that both rulers stand watch until the human's choice is known. And that meant Stephen and Jake had to guard me, follow me, protect me, and watch each other every single moment, because neither could allow harm to come to me while the other king lived. And this rule alone was enough to ignite old anger between them. I went to bed knowing that both vampire kings stood outside, silent and unmoving, watching my house under the same moonlight. And I told myself that I did not care, that I would sleep, that I would pretend none of this mattered. But my body shook with fear and exhaustion, and every time my heart raced, I felt both marks throb in response, as if Stephen and Jake were feeling it too, and I wondered what they thought as they stood guard outside my door, one cold like winter stone, the other warm like summer flame. And I imagined how the air must have crackled between them. Two ancient vampire kings forced to stand in the same space, protecting the same woman, held in place by an unspoken command of their old world. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of two vampire kingdoms, one covered in snow and blue shadows, ruled by Stephen, where vampire soldiers moved silently and vampire laws were carved in stone, and the other kingdom burned with red torches and bright halls ruled by Jake, where vampire warriors trained in open courts and vampire leaders argued loudly beneath banners of fire, and in the dream I stood between those two kingdoms while they stretched out toward me like two giant hands, one cold, one warm, and I felt myself pulled in opposite directions at the same time. When morning came, I opened my door to find both vampire kings still there, silent, watching me with unreadable eyes, one like a deep frozen lake, one like a burning torch. And for the first time I realized something that made my breath stop. Neither of them had slept, neither had moved, neither had left their place, because vampire kings did not sleep the way humans did, and they had kept watch over me all night, because they were bound by duty, obsession, power, and possibly something much darker that I did not yet understand. As I stepped into the morning light, I felt the two marks pulse again, one cold, one warm. And I sensed the shift in the world around us, because the quiet human town felt wrong now, too small to hold two vampire rulers, too fragile for the weight of their presence. And I knew that soon they would not stay silent. Soon the vampire realms would notice they were gone, and soon the rest of the vampire courts would come looking for answers. And when that happened, my life would no longer be my own, in any way at all. I understood in a slow and frightening way that my choice between the two vampire kings would not be simple or safe, because whichever king I did not choose would not simply walk away, and whichever king I did choose would gain power, status, and meaning across the vampire realms. And that kind of shift in power could start a vampire war that might tear apart both kingdoms, and even though I was only one human, I now carried the weight of immortals on my shoulders, and I finally knew that there was no going back to the life I once had. The marks continued to pulse in steady rhythm, as if the two vampire kings were waiting for me to speak, to move, to choose. And even though no words were spoken, I felt the unspoken demand from both sides of the street, cold from one side, warm from the other, and the message was the same from both vampire kings: choose. When the sun rose fully, and the morning light spilled across the quiet street where I had lived my entire life, I felt something inside the air change in a slow and frightening way, because even though Stephen and Jake still stood on opposite sides of my house, watching me with the cold patience of immortal rulers, the world around us no longer felt like a small human town. It felt like a thin border, a fragile line separating the human world from the vast and ancient vampire realms, and I sensed that the barrier was beginning to break, that the quiet life I knew was fading like mist under sunlight, and that soon the vampire world would pour through the cracks that were forming because of the two marks on my skin. As I stepped farther onto the street, trying to pretend that I could simply go about my day while two vampire kings watched my every move, I felt the cold pulse from Stephen's blood mark on my wrist, a deep, steady rhythm like a second heartbeat, quiet and controlled, as if he were reminding me that he was bound to me by ancient vampire blood magic that no one could undo, not even him. And at the same time I felt the warm glow from Jake's law claim at my shoulder, bright and strong, like a soft fire resting beneath my skin, as if his kingdom's oldest vampire law was wrapped around my body like an invisible chain, holding me in place between fire and ice. I walked to the end of the street, knowing they followed, Stephen moving through shadows without sound, Jake moving openly under the morning sun simply because he could, his vampire strength and vampire power so great that sunlight barely touched him compared to younger vampires. And as I reached the path that led toward the town's market, I felt something shift across the sky. A strange vibration, like the air itself, was being pulled in two directions, and I suddenly understood that the vampire realms had finally noticed what Stephen and Jake had done. The air grew heavy, thick, almost hard to breathe, and even though I could not see them yet, I felt the presence of other vampires. Many vampires, moving across great distances, travelling through the old pathways that only their kind could use, pathways hidden from human eyes. And these pathways were waking because the balance between the two vampire kingdoms had been broken by the double claim placed on me. A human woman who had never even known the vampire realms existed until two vampire kings descended into my life like opposing storms. As I kept walking, my hand brushing against the rough stone walls of the familiar buildings, I saw the first sign of the coming danger when a shadow moved across the sky. Not a cloud, but a large shape, fast and silent, passing in a straight line overhead, disappearing before my eyes could fully focus on it, and I felt the blood mark on my wrist ache softly, as if Stephen sensed the presence too and was preparing himself, while the warm mark on my shoulder tightened, as if Jake was bracing for a confrontation he knew was coming. When I reached the market square, the world felt wrong, off, too quiet, because the usual morning sounds, voices, footsteps, carts, were gone, as if the entire town had sensed the unseen danger and chosen to stay indoors, and I stood alone in the centre of the square, my breath shallow, my heart beating fast, the two vampire kings flanking me on either side like silent guardians, one a pillar of cold strength, the other a flame of fierce energy, and I felt small between them, painfully human. Painfully mortal, painfully fragile. Then the sky darkened. Not from clouds, but from shapes. Fast, controlled, graceful shapes, moving in the distance, not flying like birds, but gliding in ways that obeyed no human laws of movement. Shapes that reflected the sunlight too sharply. Shapes that carried an ancient and dangerous presence within them. And I knew without anyone telling me that members of the vampire councils were arriving. Vampire elders. Vampire enforcers, vampire watchers who served under both kingdoms, and they were coming to see for themselves whether the rumours racing across the vampire realms were true. The ground beneath my feet began to vibrate, as if heavy footsteps were approaching from somewhere unseen, and I watched in terrified silence as figures emerged from the distant road, tall, pale, elegant figures with the unmistakable stillness that all ancient vampires carried. And the moment they stepped into the square, I felt both Stephen and Jake shift behind me. Not in fear, but in readiness, as if they expected a battle to break out at any moment, because vampire elders were not known for their softness or their patience. And the idea that a human woman carried two separate vampire claims on her skin was something that had never occurred in any part of their long history. The first group of vampires wore deep blue cloaks, the colour of Stephen's northern kingdom, silent and cold as the winter forests they came from, their faces emotionless, their steps in perfect harmony, and as they entered the square, I felt Stephen's presence grow even colder, stronger, sharper, as if he were stepping into his true nature, the nature of a vampire king who ruled a land of frozen nights and quiet death. But then, from the opposite direction, a second group appeared, dressed in warm red tones, their eyes bright with fire and pride, their movements louder, bolder, full of emotion and intensity, and I recognized immediately that they belonged to Jake's kingdom, a land where vampire warriors trained beneath burning torches and held their loyalty like flame inside their chests, and Jake's warmth beside me grew brighter, heavier, more fierce, as if he too was stepping into the heart of his identity as a fireborn vampire king. I stood trapped between these two worlds, two armies, two forces of nature, and I felt like the centre of a storm that would tear the sky apart, and the strange part was that even though both kings had been silent since the night before, I felt their emotions through the marks they gave me, cold control from Stephen, burning anger from Jake, and beneath both emotions was something else, fear, not of each other, but of what the vampire realm would demand next. The vampire elders from both sides approached slowly, their eyes fixed on me, studying me with the same careful attention someone might give to a dangerous artifact. Something small but powerful, something that could shatter or save entire kingdoms, and I felt my body tense under their gaze, the weight of centuries pressing down on my shoulders, because these were beings who had lived far longer than any kingdom, beings who remembered every war, every law, every betrayal in vampire history, and now they were staring at me like I was a riddle they had never encountered. As the two groups of elders reached the center of the square, the air between them rippled with invisible force, a silent clash of ancient power, and even though no one spoke, I felt the question they carried inside their immortal minds. A question older than the mountains, older than any empire. A question that had never needed to be asked until now. What happens when two vampire kings claim the same human woman at the same time? I felt the marks on my skin pulse harder, almost painfully, as if Stephen and Jake were trying to shield me from the growing pressure of the vampire elders' power. And for a moment I wondered whether these elders could sense the marks too, whether they could see the silver glimmer of Stephen's blood mark on my wrist or the warm glow of Jake's law claim around my shoulder, but their eyes never left mine, as if they were trying to understand the human court between two ancient vampire rites. Then the sky cracked with another shadow, larger, heavier, darker than the ones before, and I felt a jolt of fear as a new presence spread across the square, thicker and heavier than anything I had felt yet, and I knew immediately that this was no ordinary vampire, no elder, no warrior, but something older, something powerful beyond words, something that even Stephen and Jake had not expected to arrive so soon. The ancient vampire judges, the ones who enforced the oldest laws. The ones who decided which kings lived or died. The ones who could order the execution of entire cities with a single gesture. They were here because of me, because of the marks on my skin, because of two vampire kings who refused to back down. The ground shook as they landed, three figures dressed in black robes stitched with silver threads that shimmered like starlight. And every vampire in the square, from the warriors to the elders to the kings themselves, stood absolutely still. Not out of respect, but out of fear, because ancient vampire judges answered to no one, not even to kings, and their decisions were final, merciless, unbreakable. I felt their eyes on me, cold, ancient, empty of anything human. And in that moment, the truth hit me like a strike of lightning. The vampire realms were no longer simply watching me. They were preparing to judge me. Judge the claims. Judge the kings. Judge the future. And I realized that the choice I thought I had, the choice between Stephen and Jake, was no longer mine alone. The entire vampire world wanted to choose for me. The vampire courts wanted to control me. The vampire judges wanted to decide my fate. And the two vampire kings who marked me were no longer just rivals. They were becoming enemies at the edge of a war so old and so violent that the world had buried its stories. As the ancient judges stepped closer, the marks on my wrist and shoulder burned like fire and ice, pulsing with the same message from both kings, a message heavy with desperation and fear and power. When the ancient vampire judges stepped into the center of the market square, everything around me seemed to fall away, as if the world itself had stopped breathing, because these judges carried a kind of silence that did not feel like quietness, but like the complete removal of sound, the stripping away of all warmth and all light, the erasing of everything human. And I felt that silence sink into my bones like ice that would never melt. And it became clear to me why even the vampire kings feared them, because the old judges were not rulers or warriors or political leaders. They were the voice of the law that had existed before kingdoms, before courts, before names, and they enforced vampire law with a cold, ancient force that no one could defy. I stood perfectly still because every part of my body felt frozen, not by cold, but by the weight of their presence, and the two vampire kings who had followed me through the night now stood separated by the silent pressure of the judge's power. And even though Stephen and Jake were known for their strength and were feared across the vampire realms for their ability to destroy cities when angered, I saw in the corners of my vision that they both held themselves with unnatural stillness, backs straight, shoulders tense, hands slightly curled in a way that meant they were prepared to defend me, but also unable to act until the judges revealed their intent. As the sun climbed higher, the light did not seem to touch the judges at all. as if the sunlight feared them or simply passed through them, because their bodies did not cast shadows the way Stephen and Jake did. And when I looked into their hooded faces, I saw nothing inside them. Not eyes, not flesh, not age, not emotion. Only darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly inward, as if they were not creatures at all but ancient doors the world had forgotten existed. Doors leading to a place where vampire lore began and where every vampire king learned to bow their head. The first judge stepped closer, and even though no word was spoken, I felt something slide through my mind, like a cold whisper made of nothing at all. And it wasn't speech or sound, but a feeling, a pressure, a question pushed into my body, a question that came not from their mouths, but from their existence itself. And it asked not who I was or what I wanted, but how I existed. As if the judges were searching for something inside me, testing my presence, my blood, my soul, trying to understand what made two vampire kings break thousands of years of order by marking the same human woman. The second judge lifted a hand, moving with a slowness that made the air shiver, and when that pale, long hand pointed at my wrist, the cold blood mark from Stephen flared in response, a sharp pulse that made my skin sting as if it were being written on again, and the judge's attention focused like a blade on the mark, examining it with a force that felt like it could peel back my skin if it wanted to. And I knew then that the ancient judges could sense the vampire king's power through the mark, could read the age and strength of Stephen's blood, could see the bond he placed upon me even more clearly than I did. Then the third judge turned its head toward my shoulder, and the warmth from Jake's law claim grew hotter, almost painfully strong, spreading across my collarbone and down my arm like fire moving beneath my skin. And I understood that the judge could see the old vampire law written into my body, could see the way Jake had bound his claim to me through rules older than buildings and borders, rules carved into stone tablets hidden deep in his kingdom, rules that demanded recognition and respect from all vampire realms, even those ruled by Stephen. The pressure in the air shifted again, thicker, heavier, as if the judges were comparing the two marks, weighing them the way a person might lift two stones to judge which one was heavier, and even though they did not speak, I could feel the tension between the blood mark and the law claim building inside me like two storms rising against each other, ice and fire trying to hold the same space, and it hurt in a slow, painful way that made my hands tremble and my breath turn shallow. Stephen stepped forward by only a fraction of an inch, but even that tiny movement felt like a thunderstrike through the crowd, because the cold power of his vampire lineage rippled through the air like a silent wave. And I felt the blood mark on my wrist tighten around me, as if he was silently trying to shield me from the ancient judge's examination, protecting me the only way he could while the old laws held his tongue and hands captive. At the same time, Jake tensed, his warmth becoming so intense I could almost feel it radiating through the entire square. And his law claim responded with a bright heat that pushed against the cold of Stephen's mark, as if Jake were fighting to assert that his claim carried more right, more strength, more legitimacy. And I realized then that even though both vampire kings tried not to show emotion, their marks betrayed them, their magic revealing their tension like two heartbeats clashing inside my body. The ancient judges continued standing there in front of me, their silent pressure weighing down on all of us, and I realized that they were measuring not just the marks on my body, but the balance of the entire vampire world. Because two vampire kings claiming one human woman created a fracture in the laws that had held the vampire kingdoms together for thousands of years, and this fracture could not be ignored. Not by elders, not by councils, not by warriors, and certainly not by the old judges. Slowly the judges lifted their hands again, three pale shapes rising in perfect unison. And the moment their fingers extended, I felt something inside the air shift in a deep and terrifying way, as if the entire vampire world had turned its attention toward this exact point. And I understood that the judges were about to cast their ruling, not with words, but with the ancient force that guided their existence. The first judge's hand pointed towards Stephen, and I felt the blood mark tighten sharply, painful and cold, as if the judge was recognizing the power and legitimacy of the vampire blood mark, acknowledging that Stephen had used one of the oldest vampire rituals to bind me to him. The second judge's hand pointed toward Jake, and my shoulder burned with heat, intense and overwhelming, because the judge also recognized the ancient vampire law claim, the binding force of written law, authority, and tradition that Jake had invoked when he claimed me under the rules of his realm. But then the third judge pointed toward me, and the marks on my skin flared together, ice and fire colliding so violently that I staggered where I stood, grabbing onto the wooden frame of a market stall to keep from falling, because I felt both claims battling inside me, not fighting each other, but fighting the question the judge was asking without words, a question I had not realized the vampire world could even ask. The question was simple. Too simple. Terrifyingly simple. Was I capable of surviving the weight of both claims? The judges were not choosing a king. They were not choosing a law. They were not choosing a kingdom. They were choosing whether I could endure what was happening, whether a human body and a human mind and a human soul could withstand being touched by two ancient vampire rites at the same time. The pressure grew so sharp, so crushing, that my vision blurred and my legs trembled, and even though Stephen and Jake were not allowed to move, I felt their panic through the marks, the cold panic of a winter storm breaking apart, and the warm panic of a fire roaring out of control. I felt as if the judges were reaching inside me, searching for something fragile, some inner thread, some quiet spark that would tell them whether I was strong enough to survive being claimed by two vampire kings, or whether having two immortal bonds in my body would eventually tear me apart, break my mind, break my soul, break the laws of nature that separated humans from vampires. The pain rose, sharp and blinding, and when I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, not of the human world, not of my life before, but of the two vampire kingdoms I had never visited. The cold stone halls of Stephen's realm and the fiery training grounds of Jake's realm, and I felt them pulling at me, not out of desire or anger, but because the marks inside me were connected to those lands now, and the judges were forcing me to stand between the weight of two entire vampire cultures. My breath hitched as the pressure tightened even more, and I understood that the ancient vampire judges were testing me to decide whether the vampire world should allow me to live with both marks, or whether one of the claims must be removed, which in vampire law meant destroying one of the kings, or destroying me. But then, at the height of the crushing force, something inside me did not break. Something inside me stretched. Something inside me lit up like a soft glowing thread. Something inside me held both marks without shattering, and the judges felt it. The pressure eased, not completely, but enough that my eyes opened, and I saw the third judge lower its hand slightly, not in approval, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement, as if the ancient being had found something inside me that even they did not expect. I was not just holding two vampire claims, I was surviving them. The judges withdrew slightly, not stepping back, but pulling their force into themselves, and every vampire in the square seemed to exhale at once, because the ancient beings had delivered the first part of their verdict without words. They had decided that I was not too weak to bear the double claim, but that meant the next decision was near. The most dangerous one. The ruling that would shake the vampire realms. The ruling that would decide the fate of two vampire kings. The ruling that would decide my fate. And when the judges turned towards Stephen and Jake, I felt the marks on my skin pulse again, cold and hot, ice and fire, and in their silent, ancient way, the judges sent one final message through both claims, a message meant for me alone. Choose. In the moment after both vampire kings asked me to choose, I felt something settle inside my chest that was heavier than fear and steadier than panic, something that felt like truth rising through all the chaos. And even though the ancient vampire judges still stood before us, silent and waiting, and even though the vampire elders watched with cold eyes and the vampire warriors tightened their hands on their weapons, I understood that no one could decide this except me, because the marks they placed on my skin were not chains, and the power they tried to pull from me was not my destiny. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized that the true reason the marks had not broken me was because I was stronger than either king expected. So I looked at Stephen, who carried centuries of cold sorrow inside him, and I looked at Jake, who carried burning hope and restless fire, and instead of letting their claims push me in two directions, I felt something inside myself rise up, something that felt like a human heart refusing to be ruled by vampire laws, and I lifted my head toward the ancient judges who waited for a choice that would shape the future of their realms, and I made a decision that belonged to no vampire king at all. I chose neither. Not because I did not feel the cold strength of Stephen or the warm passion of Jake. Not because I could not imagine standing beside one of them in a world of shadows and fire, but because I saw too clearly that if I chose one king, the other would fall, and his kingdom would follow him into ruin, and the two vampire realms would tear each other apart in a war that would echo for centuries, all because of a human decision that should never have held such power. And I could not carry the weight of destroying a world, not when there was a path, harder, painful, uncertain, but a path where both kingdoms could survive. The marks on my wrist and shoulder blazed with cold and heat as I rejected both claims, and for a moment I felt as if the two forces inside me were tearing me in half. But then something strange happened, something that the ancient judges felt before the vampire kings did. The marks did not shatter me, they did not crush me, they did not fight each other anymore. They dissolved, fading from my skin like frost melting and fire dying into embers, leaving behind only a faint, soft glow that drifted away like dust in sunlight. Both vampire kings staggered, not from physical force but from the sudden loss of connection, because the claims they had placed on me, claims they believed were unbreakable unless I bent to their will, had just vanished by my own hand, dissolved not through blood or law, but through choice. And the ancient judges bowed their heads the slightest amount, a movement so small it could barely be seen, but enough to tell the entire vampire world that my choice was valid, final, binding, and that no king could undo it. The cold air around Stephen shifted as he understood what I had done. The fire around Jake flickered as he felt the loss of the bond he had created, and I realized that even though I had broken the claims, I had not broken the kings themselves, because I had freed them from a war neither of them truly wanted. A war born not of love, but of ancient rules that had never imagined a human woman with a will strong enough to refuse them both. The vampire elders stepped back. The vampire warriors lowered their hands. The ancient judges turned away, their ruling complete. The human had chosen her own path, and the vampire realms must honor it. As the sun rose higher and the world regained its breath, the square slowly emptied of immortal eyes, vampire cloaks disappearing into shadows and light, and the two vampire kings stood apart from me, not as rulers demanding my loyalty, but as men, immortal, powerful, lonely, who finally understood that I was not a prize, not a symbol, not a spark to be used for war, but a person who deserved the right to stand alone. And when I finally turned and walked away from both of them, leaving the marks behind and the vampire realms trembling with the shock of my choice, I felt something inside me settle with calm strength, because I was no longer a human caught between fire and ice, no longer a token in a vampire struggle, no longer a woman claimed by two immortal kings. I was simply Mary, alive, free, unmarked, unafraid, and for the first time since the vampire kings entered my life, I felt whole. If two vampire kings claimed you in blood and law, would you choose the one who fears losing you or the one who burns the world to keep you? Like, comment, and subscribe for the next gem.